and you are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We have just completed the Jazz Zone with a tribute to Wayne Shorter and the Weather Report, and we are joined on the line by Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of a brand new book called Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C. Did you finish that title for me? It's 1900 to 2000, right?
You got it.
All right. I was writing it down when we called you. And how are you doing today?
Oh, it's all good. What about you?
Oh, it's fine with me. Fine with me.
I'm doing good. I'm here.
I guess we wanted to talk about the NATO summit. What's the status of? How do you see that?
Well, it's very important. It erupts, shall we say, in a day or two. Mr. Biden has already left for Lithuania. I assume Mr. Trudeau has left as well. It's quite remarkable that it's taking place in Lithuania, which is probably the most anti-China nation in the European bloc. That is to say that Lithuania has made it clear that it desires and craves good relations with Taiwan, the rebel island off the coast of southern China that China claims as its own. If a war erupts between the NATO countries and China, Taiwan will probably be the trigger. Also, at the NATO summit, an issue for debate will be whether Ukraine is accepted as a member. Mr. Biden is lukewarm at best. Interestingly, President Erdogan of Turkey has said that he's in favor, but I think Mr. Erdogan, as they say in London, he might be too clever by half, because he's basically vetoing Sweden's admission to NATO, which is really upset Washington. And yet he says he's in favor of Ukraine's admission, knowing that it won't happen. So I guess he assumes that coming out in favor of Ukraine may help to alleviate any sort of negativity towards his country. But I don't think so. We know that in 2016, there was an attempted coup against Mr. Erdogan, and Washington had his fingerprints all over that coup. So he's playing a rather dangerous game that might be, as noted, too clever by half. I should also say that Finland will be part of NATO, presumably after this Lithuania meeting. NATO, it seems to me, has outlived its shelf life. Position to sell in NATO because they're already gearing up for the confrontation with China, even though they have hardly dispensed with the Russia. You know that NATO has opened an office in Japan. I'm not sure if they're alert to geography, since Japan is not part of the North Atlantic. But I think what that betrays is the global ambitions of NATO. And so once again, watch this meeting very carefully, because it may very well lead to an escalation. And I say that because you know that the United States is in the process of sending these so-called cluster munitions to the theater of war in Ukraine. Even some Democrats in Congress objected. Even Annalena Baerbock, the hawkish foreign minister in Germany, objected, because these cluster munitions, they can oftentimes backfire. They can oftentimes be picked up, if they're duds, by by children, and then can explode subsequently. So this is also part and parcel of the point that, strikingly enough, NATO and the United States, they're sort of running out of artillery shells. Russia is not, because Russia has a full-bore, state-controlled military-industrial complex, and the United States military-industrial complex is basically attuned to producing these fighter jets and other profit-making instruments of war, and not necessarily artillery shells. But artillery shells are desperately needed by the Ukrainian forces. The United States cannot send them, and so therefore they're sending cluster munitions.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I remember Eduardo Monlan's sister. She, at one time, Eduardo Monlan, the leader of Frelimo, a liberation movement in Mozambique. His sister was, she sang backup with Stevie Wonder, but she had a job one time actually, going through parts of Africa testing for, those type of bombs. There was a lot of amputees. Is it Angola, Mozambique, where you had people that were not young people, but people, period, men and women that had lost limbs because of those bombs. Was that Angola or Mozambique?
Well, Angola particularly has been devastated by landmines. You may recall that the late so-called Princess Diana campaigned against landmines before her unfortunate passing. And cluster munitions are of a piece in terms of devastation with landmines. And once again, it reflects the desperation of NATO. That is to say, they constructed a situation whereby Russia would feel constrained and compelled to go to war, in a sense, because it sees a NATO presence on its western border as being inimical to its national security. NATO should have realized that, should have been preparing for war, since they were setting up a scenario destined to produce war. But once again, I think the issue was that the military-industrial complex is sort of a hustle, and the profits are to be made from fighter jets and not necessarily from artillery shells. And so therefore, NATO has been caught with its pants down.
You're listening. Go ahead, Melinda.
No, I was just wondering to add, wasn't there a ban on cluster munitions, or wasn't there, like, in 2008, or is it, the U.S. just kind of ignored that?
Well, of course, it's the latter. I mean, the international law and international human rights are for other countries. It's not for the sole remaining so-called superpower.
You're listening to.
That's all I wanted to ask.
When we're talking about Finland, didn't Vladimir Lenin live in Finland for a second, or was he in Finland when he wrote State and Revolution, or some of his great books?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but certainly, Finland shares an 830-mile border with Russia. You may know that St. Petersburg, which in some ways is a more important Russian city than Moscow, is in the shadow of Finland. You may also know that Finland was part of the Russian Empire up until 1917 in the Bolshevik Revolution, and it was there that it began to enjoy independence. But then in the late 1930s, Finland had been captured by right-wing interests, and it was manipulated to go to war against the Soviet Union and lost territory as a result. And apparently Helsinki has not learned that lesson. Interestingly enough, Mr. Biden plans to visit Helsinki during this jaunt to Lithuania. And that too is rather ominous.
Helsinki. There was an Olympic, the famous Olympics were held there. Was that in maybe 56? I don't remember. I used to know all those dates I had memorized all those dates. But I think, Belinda, you have another question?
Mute.
I think we actually have lost them for a minute, so I will get them right back. Hold on.
So Norman, let me move on to the upcoming, well, actually, before I get to the upcoming Brics Summit, let me mention the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is seen widely as a counterpoint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As its name suggests, it includes China. It also includes Russia, India, Pakistan, a number of the former Soviet Central Asian republics, and also joining the ranks per this last meeting is Iran, which is quite important because Iran continues to be in the crosshairs, not only of U.S. imperialism, but of its comrade in Israel as well. Presumably, Iran now has another layer of security because of its ascension to the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we're going to talk about the Brics in a moment, but SCO can be seen as sort of a complementary organization. Apparently, according to a Chinese news report I just read, President Xi Jinping of China is suggesting that SCO develop an infrastructure bank. And you know that Brics has an infrastructure bank. What that basically means is an entity that finances the building of bridges and highways and railways and the like, airports, etc. I assume that the proposed SCO infrastructure bank, assuming that it takes flight, will focus on infrastructure that's important for national security. And that would include, I assume, railway tracks, that would include perhaps airports and other items of that nature.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and you wanted to talk about the Brics Summit?
Well, sure. It comes up in a few weeks, but it's not premature to discuss it. There have been a flood of applications to Brics. I find one of the most intriguing possible entrants to be Mexico, because that would infuriate the United States. It might even infuriate Canada. And already there are rather tense relations between the government of Mexico City and Washington for various reasons. Saudi Arabia supposedly is a potential aspirant to the Brics: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which also is supposedly going to develop a Brics currency. That will infuriate Washington even further, because right now the US dollar is used as the major global currency. But if you have a Brics currency backed by commodities, that is to say, backed by gold, for example, which is apparently the proposal, this could help to erode the significance of the dollar, which is basically backed by the alleged goodwill of the United States of America, which, of course, is wanting, to put it mildly. So, once again, I think it's very important for folks to realize that we're living through a very important moment. Just like there's counter-revolution in motion in the United States, outside of the United States, very profound and staggering changes are afoot. And you might recall that when President Xi was in Moscow just a few months ago, as he was leaving to depart for his flight back home, that's precisely what he said, that the world is enjoying staggering and profound events. And he added the footnote that Moscow and Beijing are driving these events, which happens to be true. Speaking of which, let me mention another point about Moscow. I do a number of segments for Sputnik Radio. And I did one a few days ago, and I gave an analysis of the mutiny led by the Wagner group and Mr. Prigozhin. And it was quite critical of Mr. Prigozhin, but I understand that with regard to the tape of my remarks, which can be found on the site of the Activist News Network, that my remarks somehow were garbled. And so people couldn't understand what I was saying, even though I was, of course, quite critical of this mutiny. And I'm inferring from that it may be too early to count out Mr. Prigozhin and the Wagner group. I understand, in fact, that he's even back in St. Petersburg, which is quite remarkable, given the fact that he's been accused of trying to overthrow the government. I say that to suggest that people should stay tuned to what's going on in Russia, because the drama might not have concluded as of yet.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We are speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. And you had another question, Melinda?
Yeah, did we want to talk about Yellen in China?
Yeah, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, the Minister of Finance, if you like, Janet Yellen, has been in China for the last few days. And, the United States, there's such a stereotype. They use this good cop, bad cop scenario, which, of course, Black people are familiar with when you're dragged into the police station. That is to say, one police officer wants to beat you up. The other police officer says, hey, you better talk to him because I don't know how long I can restrain him. And that's an age-old, time-tested approach to get what you want. So Janet Yellen is the good cop. She goes to China talking about it would be disastrous if U.S. China relations were to plummet, that it would be disastrous if there was a decoupling of the regime. But the other message coming out of Washington is prepare for war. A U.S. general has suggested the war will be emerging within 18 months, believe it or not. Mr. Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator. So it's very contradictory and mixed messages. But I think Janet Yellen also went to Beijing, and one of the reasons that she's a good cop, so-called, is that the United States wants China, the People's Bank of China, to continue to loan money to the U.S. government so it could stay afloat. Already, the People's Bank has loaned the United States about $1 trillion. That's a trillion with a TR. And if somehow that were to stop, well, the United States would have to either raise taxes, which is considered to be a mark of the devil, or cut programs, which is more likely, cut aid to education, aid to healthcare, etc. And so this is a rather contradictory approach by U.S. imperialism, but I think it bespeaks the crisis in which U.S. imperialism finds itself. It also bespeaks something else, which is that obviously U.S. imperialism miscalculated when it cut the anti-Soviet deal with China 50 years ago under Nixon, and thought that pouring foreign direct investment into China would forevermore allow U.S. imperialism and its acolytes to exploit cheap Chinese labor. Well, the worm is turned. Somehow, accidentally, the United States has helped in the creation of this juggernaut known as the People's Republic of China. So they would like to reverse the tides of history that has led to that result. But how are you going to reverse the tides of history leading to that result when you still need Chinese or the People's Bank of China to continue buying treasury bills to keep the United States government afloat? So as you can see, U.S. imperialism is in a classic contradiction. And let me also say that with regard to many of the affected communities, the Black community not least, many of the leaders and intellectuals are totally oblivious to what I've just sketched and outlined, which means that they're acting irresponsibly, and it also means that they're acting dangerously.
And you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I want to ask you a sports question now. There is a brother named Elly De Cruz. He's playing De La Cruz. CRUZ or Z. Yeah. I haven't heard of that guy. I looked at I looked at a little short of him. He seems like he is another combination of Jackie Robinson and Ricky Henderson when it comes to stealing bases.
Well, it's really more than that. Elly De La Cruz, Dominican Republic, 6'5" tall, switch hitter. He hits from the right side and he hits from the left side. Already he's the fastest man in the league, maybe the fastest man ever in the sport of baseball. African of Dominican descent. He just yesterday singled, got to first base, stole second, stole third, stole home. He is a shortstop, probably has also the strongest arm in the league. That is to say, he throws the ball with more velocity than anybody in the league. Probably that will mean he'll move to the outfield, because I'm not sure if his talents are being wasted by being a shortstop. But watching him and reading about him, I have to say, it makes me wonder about human evolution, because we've never seen a person, a physical specimen like this, which then brings me to Victor Wembanyama, who, of course, was the #1 draft choice in professional basketball, roots in Africa and in France. 7'3", 7'4", 8-foot wingspan, can dunk virtually by going on his tiptoes. He had his debut the other day. It was nothing necessarily to boast about except for his shot blocking. I mean, it's going to be quite intriguing to watch him block shots when basketball season evolves and begins. He also handles the ball like a guard. He can hit 3-pointers. That is to say, he can shoot from 25 to 30 feet. Most big men, they stand close to the basket because they take advantage of their height. And once again, looking at him, it makes me wonder about human evolution. I mean, can we go further than these two young men in terms of physical specimen and talent? It leaves me baffled and befuddled.
And what do you think about the fact that his mother, a French woman, basically was one of his, I guess he was the one that basically taught him the game. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, that's what I've read. I mean, also, he's going to be with the San Antonio Spurs.
Right.
So he's getting a lot of coverage here in Houston. Houston obviously coveted him. And, he follows in the wake of Tim Duncan of the Virgin Islands and David Robinson, African of U.S. descent. U.S. Nationality, I should say.
Yes.
So San Antonio has obviously been blessed by getting talented big men, and they've been blessed once again.
They also had, that's where my good friend from Toronto, Kyrie, he started out in San Antonio, didn't he?
Kyrie Irving actually started out in Cleveland. Remember with LeBron? You must.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then of course he moved to Boston, and then he moved to Brooklyn, and now he's in Dallas, and who knows where next.
We're talking about Kyrie Irving?
Right.
Oh, boy, yeah, I'm getting a lesson today. Melinda, you had another question.
Yeah, do we want to talk about the NAACP convention in Boston?
The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which bills itself as the equivalent of the African National Congress of South Africa, in the sense that supposedly it incorporates various classes and ideological tendencies in Black America, but that's not true, because in 1950, the NAACP met in Boston. They're meeting in Boston again this year. In that 1950 convention, they purged the left. And in return, they presided over anti-Jim Crow concessions. And what's remarkable is that it was not just the NAACP that purged the left. There is a tacit, implicit slogan amongst liberals in this country, which is no allies to our left, whereas the right wing has an implicit slogan, which is no enemies to our right. And so that means the Republican Party can smile upon those who tried to overthrow the government on January 6, 2021, where the liberals, if you take someone like Amiri Baraka, who was during his era viewed as one of our leading intellectuals and writers, the NAACP went to touch Amiri Baraka with a 10-foot pole, as the saying goes. And if that particular approach was winning or prevailing and bringing in rights, which they thought was happening in the 1950s when Jim Crow began to erode after that bargain was struck in Boston in 1950, you might be able to grudgingly rationalize that particular strategy. But the Black community in the United States has been suffering defeat after defeat. And I begin to think that the liberals, they don't really understand that another approach is possible. To show you how they've been conditioned, they think what they're doing now, which is leading to defeat after defeat after defeat, is the only approach that's possible. And that's really, it's mind-blowing that that could take place, that you don't even realize that there's another way to do things. And I don't think that this convention in Boston unfolding in late July will change anything, not least because the keynote speaker will be one Hillary Rodham Clinton. So the leaders of this organization, it's I mean, you can laugh north of the border, but let me tell you, we're shedding copious tears, at least some of us south of the border.
The National Association for the Advancement of Certain People. I think that's what Marcus Garvey referred to them as.
Yeah, and then, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court was supposed to be the ultimate guarantor of the deal, because they would make sure that they would rule unconstitutional any legislation that would emerge from Congress or any executive actions emerging from the White House. But that was a misreading of history, because for most of its history, the U.S. Supreme Court has been a guardian of reaction. It's been a captive of the right wing. That was not necessarily the case in the 1950s, but they should have realized that that was a black swan event, so to speak. It was not the norm, that the U.S. Supreme Court then was headed by the former California governor, Earl Warren. But even Earl Warren, as California governor, had presided over the internment of Japanese Americans between 1941 and 1945 and the looting and plundering of their property. So that should have been a dead giveaway that he was a shaky guardian of civil rights and civil liberties, certainly not a man you could rely upon and depend upon. And certainly that should have been an indication that this bargain struck in 1950 was doomed to failure.
And I will say this and we'll end, and that was Yuri Kochiyama and her husband, Bill Kochiyama. They were interned, I think they were in Long Beach, somewhere in California for during that period, being of Japanese ancestry.
They were probably moved inland because the whole idea was to get the folks of Japanese ancestry away from the coast.
Right, exactly. No,
inland.
No, you're right. You're right. I'll do some research. Well, I'll Google it as soon as I get off, and I'll put it on my Facebook exactly where they were. But Yuri grew up in Long Beach. That's what's got me thrown off. And Yuri Kochiyama was the Japanese woman that was giving Malcolm X mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. She was there when Malcolm was assassinated. That is Yuri. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, it's time to say farewell.
All right, and thanks, Lisa. Thank Melinda Francis, and I guess we will see you in the whirlwind.